For 2.5 years now in Ukraine, we continue to see a very serious crisis. This is provoked by the coup d'etat with external support. The American and British permanent representatives have sought to say that the source of the crisis was Crimea's union with Russia. No, you will not be able to convince us in this way. Crimea is a stable peninsula if you compare it with Donbass in former Ukraine. Over the entire crisis, the Security Council, unfortunately, has been used as a propaganda platform. The only but significant achievement that's been achieved here was the adoption of 2202 and the adoption of the package of measures on the 12th of February last year. In adopting that resolution, the Council took responsibility for implementing those package of measures, and that's what we must focus upon. Now, some Western colleagues have discussed with us, and they recognize that the package of measures is not being implemented by Kiev. However, they do say that President Poroshenko has personally agreed that document in Minsk, but does not have enough political support to implement its provisions. We do not accept such explanations. Now, why is the Ukrainian leaders seize power through a coup d'etat if they're not able to govern the country? We will closely observe how the new government in the Ukraine operates. Who was well known for his aggressive statements, Mr. Yushchenko, has left the Prime Minister's post. Now, between the President and the new Prime Minister, it seems that there are no serious contradictions and that the Prime Minister does intend to implement reforms. But it does seem clear that there's no successful reform, and it can't be possible if the bloody conflict is not settled and if the Ukrainian society does not come together and does not reject the enmity and extreme nationalism. Now, in this context, we have listened to the proposal of the delegation of Ukraine of holding this meeting of the Security Council this afternoon, particularly since President Poroshenko has announced that this was his own personal initiative. It's important to know what the new power structure in Kiev will have on its implementation of the Minsk agreements, particularly since in putting forward that initiative, the Kiev authorities, as normal, consulted with Washington. And an assistant of the U.S. Secretary of State went to Kiev. In bilateral contacts with the U.S., they say that they want to have a constructive contribution to settling the crisis in Ukraine, even joining the Normandy format. However, as in practice, as we've often seen, their cooperation with Kiev has a negative effect. It leads to a radicalization of the Ukrainian authorities and further aggressive rhetoric. This has happened once again. Now, such a policy of a hidden agenda undermines trust in Washington. And we've seen this in many other occasions, not just in Ukraine, and everybody knows this. Today's statements by the United States representative is a further example of this policy. Now, today's statement by the Ukrainian delegation is very disappointing. There's a lot of rhetoric, but there are no specific plans of how to implement the Minsk agreement. Mr. President, the tasks now facing Kiev in implementing the package of measures is very clear. It's very important to have this political triad. First, changing the Ukrainian constitution and adopting a permanent special status for Donbass. Secondly, adoption of a law on elections in Donetsk and Lugansk in agreement with their local representatives. And third, addressing the problem of the amnesty related to the events that took place in Donetsk and Lugansk. Now, none of these issues has been resolved. Kiev continues to refuse direct talks with representatives from Donbass or to agree their steps with them as is provided for under the Minsk agreement. Kiev loves to talk about the fact that this is Russia that is now implementing the package of measures. But how can we adopt all these laws in the place of the Ukrainian parliament or put them into power in the place of the Ukrainian president? It's clear that what they're talking about is postponing their problems because they've got a headache over this. Now, from Kiev, we always hear that the main obstacle to moving forward with the fundamental issues of the settlement is the unsatisfactory cessation of hostilities regime. But if we think logically, and if you consider the facts from the SSMM's report, it very clearly becomes whose interests are are being in the contact line are being considered. Now, new ideas are always being put forward about either deploying UN peacekeepers or police with heavy weapons, but that would be very comfortable for them. First of all, they worsen tension, and then they come up with solutions that have nothing to do with resolving those problems. Now, the only object here is to play for time and draw attention away from the non-implementation of the Minsk agreement. We are concerned at statements of a worsening situation in the conflict zone in Donbass. The situation began to hot up last December, particularly after the Ukrainian armed forces began to occupy towns in the neutral strip. And in some occasions, they even crossed the contact line as defined by the Minsk agreement. We view these acts as very dangerous and provocative. Ukrainian forces must leave these towns. This assessment is supported by the SMM of the OSCE. On the 17th of April, last representatives of Ukraine forces discussing with OSCE observers did not hide Kiev's intention to occupy new territories. Now, the number of violations of the ceasefire recently have been equal to the hot period of the summer of 2015. Every day we've seen 4,000 such violations. OSCE statistics show that the Ukrainian side is most responsible for this. From the 4th to the 21st of April, a special monitoring mission noted 3 use of Ukrainian heavy weapons in the security zone. The most recent report says that there are only Ukrainian weapons are still in the previous positions. They are still using heavy weapons against Donbass towns. As a result of this, they're destroying houses, and there are civilians who are suffering as a result. Yesterday, the Ukrainian forces, using 120 millimeter weapons, attacked Olenivka, and civilians were killed, including a pregnant woman. Now, the British colleague said he doesn't care who's shooting, but it is important to us. Now, a proposal has been made to improve the situation with regard to the security. We need to have OSCE in there as observers, and we must put limits on Kiev's possibility to move between the various zones. We must also control the storehouses of weapons, and if necessary, put in video cameras. And we must also have mirror patrols. We must step up our efforts to ensure that there is local ceasefire and have the joint coordination control and have patrols of that center. And we must have direct contacts between the various divisions. All this can seriously reduce the number of incidents. However, it's still clear, and this has been shown by many regional crises throughout the world, that maintaining a ceasefire without resolving the political problems is impossible. Together with the implementation of the Minsk agreement and national reconciliation in Ukraine is continuing to prepare for war. A new example that instead of reform is the decision to set up in the ministry the so-called anti-terrorist operations section. In the occupied territories, Representative Donetsk and Lugansk continue to be called separatists, despite the fact that they signed the Minsk agreement measures and demonstrated the fact that they are willing to continuing to live in an Ukrainian state, and there's still an economic blockade on Donbass. All means are being used to call them terrorists and attack them as such. And there's abuse of individuals, there's and also other punishment. And much of this is referred to in the report on the rapporteur on human rights in Ukraine. They prefer not to talk about this. Now, the American and British permanent representatives talked about our humanitarian convoys in Donbass. From the very beginning, we called upon the Ukrainian power to organize their monitoring at the border, but Kiev refused it. They refused to carry out such inspections. Now, this could be a means for cheap propaganda, but it's the people of Ukraine that suffer. Mr. President, today it's not possible to forget the tragic date, the 2nd of May 2014, in Odessa, 108 people were burnt alive, and people continue nobody has been punished. The Council of Europe's Committee on Ukraine says that the EU Convention on Human Rights has not been respected with regard to dealing with the people responsible for that. We call upon the members of the Security Council not to forget that tragic event. It's important to establish the truth and bring those responsible to justice. In this context, we can only feel we refer to the recent statement by the Ukrainian Parliament and the commander of Maidan. It shows that there was a provocative participation of snipers, both there and in Odessa. It's not surprising that when he assumed this post, he proposed that parliament that they should remove the special status of Donbass from the draft bill and any changes to the constitution on that point. Now, the recent meeting with them by high-level representatives from Washington once again reminds us of the mechanism behind those bloody events. Mr. President, in conclusion, I'd like once again to stress that what is so extremely important for today is to implement the package of measures for the Minsk agreement and the strict and consistent and full implementation of the provisions of that agreement. This is the only way forward to settling the conflict in Donbass and to resolve all related problems. Mr. President, this concludes the main part of my statement, but if you allow me, I'd like to make two brief contexts. As you know, my first contact, as you know, the issue of Crimea, well, the Security Council, we're not discussing it because this is a domestic affair of Russian Federation. But I'd like to, somebody wanted to raise this, so I'd like to comment it. Indeed, the Mejlis of Tatars in Crimea was banned by Russia because of its extremist activities. In some countries, they did not pay enough attention to dealing with extremism, and we see what serious consequences this has brought. We will not repeat such mistakes. The reality is that over recent times, there's been a new wave of movements of population between Russia and Crimea, of that population. And we've seen more than 1,000 statement requests from Uzbekistan, for example, and they've been agreed to. Now, Kiev should concern itself about Donbass rather than the Tatars in Crimea, where they were heavy weaponry attacking the civilian population. The civilian population is under economic blockade. Kiev, on a daily basis, is doubting the rights of these people to health and to their very life. We note that after recent years in Ukraine, they've banned the Communist Party and many other parties, and they have suppressed people's access to media. And they have also destroyed Orthodox churches. The Parliament has a draft bill which is aimed at banning the activities of that church in Ukraine. And the 12,000 people go to that church. The same would be to ban the Catholic Church, for example, because they don't like that church. So the Ukrainian colleagues and others are selective human rights activists, and they shouldn't give sermons to us. And now another minor comment, if I may. Mr. Sajic, in his statement, said something which seemed rather strange to me. He said it requires an answer to the control issue of Ukraine over its borders. But the answer to this is in two paragraphs, paragraphs 9 and 11 of the package of measures. It says that when the elections are held, then Ukraine will once again have control over the border. And there are 8 paragraphs, articles, as to what should be in the constitution about the special status of East Ukraine, Donbass. So the answers are there, but we must do so in line with the provisions of that agreement and draw up laws in agreement with the representatives of those regions. The Ukrainian authorities does not want to do it, and they all this is a cause of serious concern. Thank you, Mr. President. I do apologize. It's a very important fact. I've been told that when I talked about the increase of the presence of Ukrainian armed forces on the line of contact, I said the following. The most recent report of the Special Military Mission has noted that in Ukrainians' warehouses, only 9% in their warehouses. Most of the part of these weapons are on the frontline positions. And this shows the detention of Kiev with regard to a peaceful settlement in Donbass. Thank you very much.